This is Henry Chamberlain, and I will be speaking with Sharon Rudahl, a masterful cartoonist from the underground comics era up till today. She's one of the founders of Women's Comics, and one of her long form works was The Adventures of Crystal Knight. Her graphic novels, A Dangerous Woman, the story of Emma Goldman, and of course the most recent, a biography of Paul Robeson, A Ballad of an American, published by Rutgers University Press. Thank you for joining me here, Sharon.
Thank you for having me, Henry.
And I wanted to also point out that you marched with Martin Luther King Jr. So it seems like you've always been an activist at heart.
I think I've always felt alienated from the greater society at heart. And there were times when it seemed that people were coming around to similar points of view that were very exciting. And there were times like recently when I look at the news and I can't believe I'm on the same planet.
Well, I feel the same way. I'm going to go ahead and provide a kind of a slideshow for us. And of course, we want to jump right into Paul Robeson. And this is such a beautiful book. And what ended up happening as I put these images together is we're kind of going backwards. We're starting from the present day, and then we'll just move back as we go, but it'll all make sense. But the focus here, of course, is Paul Robeson. And I love these pages. This is one of the early pages. And it sets the tone for what the reader should expect. It's going to be a struggle for Paul Robeson, and it's his character that's going to lead the way. Would that be fair to say that as a way to introduce things?
Well, I wanted to situate him in time and history. I find as I go on that in a way time is the subject that interests me even more than the individual characters moving through it. I spent a lot of time on, looking at cars and radios and shoes and things, and even styles. It's very subtle because I'm not good enough to make it overt enough, but I would have liked these early images to evoke some of the illustration style of the late 19th century. And then as we move into the period of the Harlem Renaissance, to get a little bit of the jazzy deco look. And then my 40s images of both of fascism and of performances of Otello, I tried to be influenced by 40s graphic art.
And then I wanted to zero in on this one panel, this from the same page. And of course, this speaks to today, because today we have a whole revisiting of these issues. And here it's Ida Wells taking to task President McKinley. And I'll just quote this: "Nowhere in the civilized world, save the United States, can men hunt down, shoot, hang, or burn to death an unarmed, absolutely powerless individual." Of course, the president isn't there to talk about that at all, is he?
He's just trying to show off that he's interested in all the different people that he administers, but he doesn't actually show any interest. You know what I'm just finally getting around to reading to? Is It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. It's about fascism in the US. And actually what's shocking me so much is that his image of the fascist leader that comes to power, it's sort of like a clever, more intelligent, more functional Trump. I mean, we've actually been debased from what he imagined people would have to be like to accept fascism here.
Yeah. I've been meaning to read that. Yeah, a lot's been said about it.
I like this panel. I like the one with I tried to do this, film noir thing with the Venetian blinds. My reach always exceeds my grasp. I try to get images that I'm really not capable of presenting, but I think I got the feeling of that sort of the trapped character in the film noir movie there that I was aiming at. But now I'll tell you, now your listeners are going to get secret inside information, what cartoonists really suffer from. On the upper triangle of that image, I never did convince myself that I had the thumb on the right side of his hand, and I tortured myself over that for many hours. I'd be very curious in a poll whether people think that hand actually came out anatomically.
I know what you're saying, that we get so self-conscious as because I'm a cartoonist as well. We get really self-conscious about these issues of the hand, the placement of the hand. Is the thumb where it should be? And so yeah, but it looks wonderful.
But see, that's my work as a craft craftsperson. That's my work as a craftsperson. I don't have to really, because I've always been so over the top as far as my political and personal beliefs, I don't really have to like stir that up. What do you think about racism? You know, it's like, should I strangle you or should I draw a cartoon? So what I have to worry about is how am I doing my job as a craftsperson of presenting the information I have, of presenting the stories that I have to work with. I never actually chose to do nonfiction, but like many people in the arts, you know, I scrabble around and take any job I can get that'll give me a chance to do what I do. So when I do nonfiction, I'm looking for the meaningful stories that occur in real life. And it's amazing what great stories actually occur in real life. I don't think I would have found them if I hadn't been forced to. But then again, it's my job as a craftsman not to come in and move those stories around and change them, but to present them in a way so that the reader and the viewer can get out of them what I got out of them. That's my work. That's what I do.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. And then I'm just going through these first.
This is the first page, and I really move up a little bit. I really, you know, threw out all the stops on this, and I'm very proud of it as a way of presenting that information about his father, his grandfather being, I guess, yeah, it's his grandfather being sold and given away in a will, and you see the will,
Yeah.
and then you see the slave been inherited coming in slightly from above. And again, I'm not that good at that. You know, if I was making a movie, I would definitely have my camera up on a higher dolly, but that I was able to pull off what I wanted to pull off. And then him in the swamp. Oh, and that's the first reflection of that moon that you noticed. When you get ready, I want to tell you more about that moon. Is this a good time?
Well, let me focus in a little bit so people can see what we're talking about. This present moon.
There. I called it to myself. There it is. You can see it. To myself, I called it the fatal moon. And you noticed that it was on, let's see, also on page 82, which is where it really encounters fascism for the first time. But it also occurs on page 9 when he realizes that his mother is dead and never coming back. It occurs on page 37 when he's walking at night with his wife talking about no blacks ever having played or Othello on Broadway, and it occurs on page 115 when he's feverish on the train in Tashkent shortly before sort of his last being able to actually be mentally whole enough to perform as he had as a full person. At that point, he is meeting his fate, and you see if you want to turn to page, can you turn to page 82 and show people, or is that too hard?
I'm not. I'm not really set up to do that, but I can show that at later on.
Later, okay. Well, later on, we're going to look at page 82, the last appearance of the fatal moon, and I'll explain all the strange creative ideas that went through my mind working on that panel. None of which the reader will ever see, but I think it's important when artists get involved and entertain themselves that much too, that they do a better job. I mean, there's many a backstory that the reader will never know, but that it's helped inform. You noticed the moon without noticing all the places it appeared, but it helped tie together the visual text for you. It helped make the story cohere for you, I think. So that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be figuring out how to do.
Yeah, it makes for, well, obviously it makes for a richer experience. Now, I fib. I do have page 82. I've lost track of my images, but here it is.
Well, that's okay. So that's when he's first been chased by the Nazis and first comes to a full realization of the fascism and racism, that they really are the same thing.
That is such a close call. I mean, the Nazis could have just nabbed him, and somehow they hesitated just long enough and spared his life.
Again, this is my movie, and I made a scene that apparently works for people. It's a story that was told by someone he was traveling with. We don't know how much it was embroidered and altered before it even got to my hands, but it was such a good story, I didn't want to know. I wanted to use it.
Yeah,
it's a ballad book. I get to do stuff like that.
Well, of course, it's fascinating because I mean, it's a graphic novel. You're part of it is the entertainment component to it.
Right. But I'm always looking for the story that tells the real story, you know, because it's a real story. Oh, and this, okay, and that's the part that my heart is closest to. But I made it, this part, I have to be honest, I basically made it all up. I asked Paul Robeson and the other people I was working with that knew more about Robeson, you know, at what point did he stop just being a good-natured entertainer who believed that, by being very successful at what he did, that he would raise the position of blacks. At what point did he become committed politically? What was his road to Damascus moment? What angel appeared to him? And nobody really knew. Nobody really even had anything to offer. So he later became very involved with the Welsh miners. And there was a footnote in Duberman, which is the most serious text about his life at this point, that he had marched with them spontaneously in is it 1928? Anyways, I have the date on the page somewhere.
Yeah,
And so
1928.
I evolved that, and that really was the sort of thing that in movies about artists, the artists have inspirations like that. I was sitting at breakfast, and all of a sudden I thought about how I wanted to say it, and I wrote out the rough script of it on my corner of my newspaper, and I looked across the table at my youngest son, and I, what do you think of this? And I read him what I was going to do in those pages. And then, kind of revised. And I had to, again, actually drawing Ku Klux people that look like Ku Klux people, but that also look like puppets. I mean, there's the hard parts that you have to make those parts work to do what it is you were trying to do. I'm a one-person movie company. I have to sew the costumes, I have to make the sets, I have to write the script, I have to place the camera. It's very hard work drawing things like this, but there's a tremendous amount of freedom and a chance to really exercise your vision about things. And the things I got to say in the Robeson book, I guess, are the things I've been storing up that I wanted to say my whole life. So that's what I have to say about that. You want to show the other pages of this?
Yeah. Well, there must be some truth to this, because there's that YouTube video of Paul Robeson singing to Welsh miners.
It's a little later in his life. He's invited to Wales, and he does sing, and he also makes a movie there. So there was a very tight link. But the Welsh miners were the blackest white men Paul had ever met. There's nothing in history or quotes or anything anybody, his biographer, ever said that he ever saw or said anything like that. But to me, that was an important summation of who Paul Robeson was and what he can help us all to achieve. And then I explained it. Not only were the miners' skins blackened by coal, but they did the hardest, most dangerous work for low wages. Their children often went hungry and had no decent schools or medical care. The miners worked without safety gear and died young. Yeah, you can see exo panels. Their sons followed them into the mines, while the mine owners and their stockholders got richer day by day. And there we have the real cartoon, capitalists with the sticker.
Yeah.
And then here he's thinking, what if behind the thug mobs of racism, there were more powerful mob bosses, gang lords who stirred up and took advantage of racism? As long as working people could be divided by fear and hatred, blinded to their true enemies, the gang bosses would feast in peace on the lives of the poor. And that's, that's the most personal part of the whole book. And at the same time, it's one of the most universal parts of the whole book, because I feel in a way what we're getting in this country now is something of a cultural revolution that we're ready for. We need it, but we also need an economic revolution. We also need a political revolution. A cultural revolution without an economic revolution just means, people will be oppressed, continue to be oppressed by the same oppressors, and they'll still be just turned on each other. Maybe they'll be turned on each other by class or something instead of by race. But the important thing is that we not be turned on each other, that we work together for everyone. And I tried to express that in these pages.
Yes. Well, I have a question. It's I don't know how much of a question it is, but do you think the protest today is as loud as it's ever been? I guess it is. I mean, how can it not be? Or is it different because we have all these different generations protesting?
It's different. When I was in marches before the Martin Luther King March that people remember. And I was in marches against Vietnam when it wasn't called Vietnam, when it was a police action in Indochina, very small marches. But people faced real police brutality. I'm not saying they didn't last summer, but it was a lot more overt. And there was a sense of it building. And there were also organizations. I'm going to be a real old fogey and say you need organization and you need leaders. That people just doing what spontaneously appeals to them in the moment, that's important. But what do you fall back on when they leave the streets? What do they leave behind? We had SNCC, we had CORE, we had, there were people working day and night, putting out publications, feeding communities, advancing legislation. It's not enough just to get people in the streets. The people in the streets, I mean, that's that's the munitions of the poor, but you have to have something that you're expending those munitions to make avail, to make real, to bring into meaning, to bring into being.
Yeah.
I was briefly in the streets last summer because I was really locked down as an old person likely to get the plague, but we were so close to demonstrations in Hollywood. I actually heard them through the window and was able to go out and join. And the spirit was wonderful, but it was a very unformed sort of spirit. And there was nobody there taking people's information down, nobody there organizing anything. And I frankly think, again, I'm going to be a real old fogey, yes, yes, humor person, and say, I think when we put up flyers, when we had mailing lists, the fact that it's just like, computer dating or something, or, it doesn't affect as much change in society. You do need to organize.
No, I agree. Now, this page really struck me because it ties in with your other graphic novel, Emma Goldman. Here you have Paul meeting Emma.
Yeah, that was fun to do. Both of them were fun to do. It was fun to draw Paul when I was writing about Emma, and it was fun to draw Emma when I was writing about Paul. In that one, the two things that are important to me as a cartoonist are, I really had a lot of trouble with the inside of her arm, having it go back the right way, holding the babka, whatever it is. And the other thing is the expression on his Essie's face when he says Kugel's his favorite. If I'm a better cartoonist than I am, you would see that with the thought balloon over her head is that you never had potato kugel in your life. So,
Yeah.
do you get that a little bit? But
Yeah.
he's such a loving, considerate, nice guest that of course he wants Emma to think he loves her kugel. But I'll tell you the most important thing about Emma Goldman in this book for me is that they did have such a warm, mutually admiring relationship that times when I thought, do I have the right as a little old Jewish lady to tell the story of this great Black athlete and actor and performer? My life has been so different than his, and there probably are people that could tell the story better, and maybe he would be offended. And then I thought of his relationship to Emma, and I thought, nah, he had a warm spot for little old Jewish radical ladies. He would have been. I have a strong feeling he might not have agreed with every panel, but I think he would have been cool with my doing it. And his relationship with Emma is what I was able to refer to whenever I had my doubts about that.
I totally agree with that. Now I wanted to jump over to, oops. Oh, what is going on?
See, I stick in on my own interests too, Ballet Ruse. Well, there's Emma.
So I just had a few pages to share with folks about this graphic novel or graphic biography. And so these are just some samples looking through the book, looking through her life. If there's any thoughts that strike your fancy, I know I'm kind of throwing these.
This is a long time ago for me now. One thing I noticed is the visual style, I think, has changed, that it was more florid and decorative at that time, and it's got simpler and more woodcutty in the decades since. But I just look different to you, or what do you think? The basic drawing style.
I love it. I'm a fan of both of the books. So I have. Okay. I think they organically flow together, and yeah, I think things may be a little bit more crisp in the Paul Robeson book, but so they're kind of different animals in a way, but they're both interconnected, of course.
Okay. And I love lettering. I mean, to me, lettering, display lettering is part of your arsenal, again, of what you bring to do this job of conveying a story. And the old movies that still have the title pages and stuff, that have the beautiful illustrations and the beautiful lettering, I'm influenced by that. I enjoy working those out. Well, but the lettering should be expressive, just like the drawings are expressive.
It was fascinating to see Emma grow as a person, from a tentative speaker to just a full leader.
That is amazing. I agree. But I remember way back when I was born in the 40s, and when I was a little kid, I think it was some relatives of mine actually used to say, if you don't behave, you're going to turn out like Emma Goldman. So this is what I've been preparing for a long time. Yeah. I mean, this I never had a doubt I was the right artist for. Paul Robeson, there is the doubt. Am I there was the doubt. Do I have the right to do this? I had to earn the right by doing a good job. But Emma, there's no question I'm the right person for Emma Goldman.
So a lot of cartoonists talk about how they're doing this one book, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking about the next book. When did the Paul Robeson project become a possibility for you? Was it way after the Goldman book, or was it somewhere during the Goldman book?
Say, I can't say this enough. If I were just doing what I wanted to do, it wouldn't have been either of them. I wanted to do a book about China. I can read Chinese. I taught myself. I traveled and stayed with families. I have a lot of things to say about Chinese culture and Chinese communism that nobody would be interested in now, but 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, they might have been, but I couldn't find a publisher. The Paul Robeson book, Rutgers University Press contacted Paul Robeson and said, could you recommend an artist to do a Paul Robeson book? And Paul emailed me, would you want to do a Paul Robeson book? And, I'd never thought of it, but when I was like, this is my book, don't let anyone else have it. And I fought to keep it. But these aren't things I picked to do myself. This is a job of work I was hired to do. And maybe that's how I work best. Maybe if I just did what I wanted to do, it wouldn't be as good. I wouldn't have to work as hard. So I'm not sorry about anything I've done, but I never wanted to do nonfiction. I never wanted to do biography. I like to do science fiction. I like to tell stories. And if there's any culture I always really wanted to explore, it's Chinese culture. So here you go. Oh, so let me just tell you why I have an audience. There was something called the May 5th movement in China in 1915. That's exactly like 1968 in Europe and the United States. And the modern Chinese language was invented then. And that's when girls threw off their foot bindings and boys threw off doing what their fathers told them to do. And they invented a modern literature that had writers that are like Orwell or Jack London. I mean, some of the great left-wing original writers in the world were writing in this newly invented Chinese language starting around the late 19 teens. And the people in the West don't know about it at all. And these are brothers and sisters we need to know about. And the most interesting thing lately is the current Chinese government, which treated these people as heroes and icons, is now disappearing their work, is now discouraging people from knowing anything about their work because they're complete anti-capitalists and they're complete individualists and they're complete sexual pioneers. And the current communist government doesn't want us to know about them any more than the American Republican government want us to know about them. And I've never had my chance to tell people about them, but if I ever do, it'll be great. So that's the book I've been thinking of for 20 years and nobody wants to publish it.
Oh, well, I don't know what to say. I would love to do a book like that. Just keep trying, or
yeah, it's very hard. I mean, this is true for musicians, dancers, film. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunities I've had, but it is a tiny percent of a tiny percent that gets to do anything they want to do in the arts, and to have the sort of carte blanche, you can just decide to do whatever you want to do. Well, that's really that's like being one of those guys that can afford to shoot themselves into space. There's not many people in that position.
Well, I guess what strikes me is that it does feel like a passion project. You really put your heart into these books. So,
isn't that surprising? But that's the way it has to be. When somebody gets a movie deal, when they call up some director and say you can direct a book about a movie about X, Y, and Z, I mean, it becomes a passion project. You've passionately been wanting to practice your art, and you have an opportunity. I live in Hollywood, and I used to go to the flea market here all the time, and that's how actors talk. Are you working? Are you working? It's like, are you breathing? Are you eating? It's more important to breathe and eat than to be picky about what you breathe in.
Yeah. So here's part of the Paul Buell connection. I know you've done other things with Paul.
Many, yeah.
This is a fairly recent book, 2015, and here's a wonderful page. And here it's the inauguration, and Lincoln is making an analogy to a divorce, which I thought was quite intriguing for him to even be talking about divorce. He said, a man and a woman can divorce, but a country, no, that's another thing. I just thought that was really
it is interesting.
Intriguing. It seems so modern for him to even say that. We cannot separate. A husband and wife may be divorced and go their separate ways, but the different parts of our country cannot do this.
Yeah, Lincoln's really was an interesting figure. My only personal connection is that I grew up in Virginia and Maryland, where practically every other field was a Confederate battlefield, or a Confederate graveyard, or a Union battlefield. And so there was a lot of the flavor of that period had been communicated to me just as a part of my childhood that I enjoyed. But I didn't know that much about making when I started. This is something I actually worked out with the Emma Goldman book, though, that when I was doing biographies of people that had they spoke for themselves better than I could speak for them, then I would just quote what they had to say. And I always just distinguish it very simply by putting quotes on it. And then what I have to say, I put in narration by and large. With, as I say, a little bit of dialogue sometimes interpolated just to move things along. I mean, and more coffee, please, or something. But as far as when they say important things, it has to be something that I'm not going to put words in their mouths. It's going to be something they actually wrote or said.
Yeah, I love some of the narrative devices you use. Like in the, you'll have the character later in life commenting on something going on as they're a younger person. I just love that. I think there's an example from far further back, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do. I definitely use that in the Paul Robeson. But see, sometimes even that, in that case, it was because I was reading Paul Robeson's own brief sort of autobiography, and when I was quoting what he had to say about his past, he had already sort of simplified it and made it more like a graphic novel and made it more palatable. And so I had him say it as someone who's looking back on his past, maybe in a slightly rose-colored way, rather than something that a contemporary said. So even that there was a practical reason for, but sometimes it's just that I like to do that. I don't know. It comes to me more easily stuff like that than the elbows and the knees and stuff come to me. What can I say? But I don't think it means that I should be a prose writer though, because prose seems really empty to me without pictures. But I wouldn't at all mind doing things that were like illustrations with words rather than balloons coming out of people's mouths. I've done some of that and enjoyed it. But and this is something I remember from How Did You Become an Artist? My parents had this book series that was sort of inexpensive classics for working class people that want to elevate their education, and they had some of the Brontes. Wuthering Heights, so I'm specifically remembering Wuthering Heights. And when I learned to read, when I was maybe 6 or 7, going back to these illustrations that I had loved by Fritz Eichenberg, I think, illustrations. And the story that these are great books that I love and appreciate, but the stories that the words told weren't as exciting as the stories that the woodcut illustrations that I had been reading from the illustrations all the time before I could read. So I think that was a real influence on my visual storytelling, what I wanted to achieve.
Yeah. Now I think this is probably your only work of science fiction, The Adventures
I've
of
done some
Crystal
short
Knight.
fiction science fiction, some of the women's comics and Forbidden Sex and some of the Dennis Kitchen books. If you've been getting stuff through my Wikipedia, it's missing like 90% of my work. I hope sometimes somebody will update it and include some of these other places. But I've always loved science fiction, though I don't pretend that my science fiction is at all fictiony. It's always just sort of the Philip K. Dick world that we're living in anyway, which is a good place to tell the kind of stories that I want to tell. So I don't make any effort to invent, new sources of energy or anything, or different ways for people to flit around. It seems to me that it's very much a world that we all recognize now, just as much as we recognize the world of King Arthur or the world of Homeric Greece or something. There's this not so far in the future that's a lot like now that we all know. We've all spent lots of time there in movies and in science fiction books.
Well, if for those who are familiar with this on any level, this is referring to the night of broken glass, the Crystal Night, which we have here in the old story. This is the opening page, and then we jump right into the book.
And there's a science fiction book, and then there's the final inside page, which is sort of the summation of what happens after you do have a revolution. Yes. No, I love doing science fiction. Again, if someone ever asked me to do it, I would do it in a minute, but that's not something anyone's ever asked me to do. Paul loves biography, so I have become a biographer. And I've learned things and accomplished things I could never have done otherwise. So you will get no complaints from me. Being forced to do something that's not your first choice might be a very good way to stretch yourself as an artist, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Then here's Underground Classics around that same time period. I think Crystal Night was 1980. This is 1979 or something.
It's a collection of a lot of the stories from the women's comics era. But you see, this is the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm crying and saying, but I believed in sex, drugs, and communism, which of course
Yeah.
don't really get played except hippies, but it still kind of sums it up. And people are saying, bring back the Tsar, which of course they're still saying. And the comrade is saying, don't worry, be happy, comrade, go with flow.
Yeah, that's definitely 1989. And
Yeah, and this is a Yiddish song that I learned from an LP that a friend gave me for a birthday present. And I just got in the habit of singing it. And then this is how I visualize it. I love working for music. And that's another reason that Paul Robeson was a good choice, because I know a lot of the folk songs that he sung. I mean, I've heard them and I listened to him. I got a lot of old CDs of his and listened to him singing while I worked. There's one from Wimmen's Comix. It's an old American folk song, Katie Cruel. It's a rather if not X-rated American folk song from the 18th century that I visualize as a comic. I love visualizing music too. And in, I think it's in Yiddishkeit, there's Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, which is one of my just few favorite things I've ever done. If you ever have a chance, have you ever seen Paul Boole's Yiddishkeit?
No.
Was about 30 pages of mine in there. And again, this Brother, Can You Spare a Dime is one of the pinnacles of my work. I mean, I put every bit of myself into it. Because the wonderful thing that gave me an opportunity to do is illustrate music with people being able to play the music in their heads without my having to supply an instrument. Because I figure at least 90% of the people that would look at the book, if they're reading the words to Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, they're able to hear their favorite rendition of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime. So I was able to actually make a music video.
Yeah,
it's a good one. You should definitely look it up.
I will.
Okay, well, that's it. It's been a spotty life, but an interesting one. So what do you think of this fourth wave of plague anyways? That seems to be the big story of the day, or fifth wave of
God.
plague. Do you think we're all back in our foxholes, or do you think it'll come and go?
Well, I'm fully vaccinated, so I feel confident that even if I get it, I'll survive it. But my God.
We don't measure up well against the Dark Ages as far as the public health measures we've taken. I'm sorry to point out. Quarantine if you feel like it. The honor system doesn't really seem to be working. I mean, I'm trying to take heart from the fact that most of the targets seem to be my political opponents, but it doesn't really cheer me up that much. I don't want to see people get sick unnecessarily.
No. Well, this I sort of just stumbled upon. Albert DeLawyer and serve the people.
You know, don't even remember this. This was a fundraising thing for somebody's bail or somebody's lawyer legal fees or something.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I don't remember even exactly what it was anymore. Does it explain the situation at all? Oh, it's for that. Oh, it's okay. So he was working for the comic book producers of the comic book stores to keep them from being busted for obscenity. And artists all chipped in and produced this to be a fundraiser.
Oh, I see. Well, I just thought it was a wonderful example of a one-pager, because that's the way cartoonists would start out, but at least create one page and get that in a publication somewhere. Yeah, this lawyer doesn't seem too enthusiastic about anything regarding people's rights.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really brought down the underground cartoonists as a medium. The comic book stores were closed. The publishers were refused to publish anything. There was a paper shortage. It's a whole bunch of things. So there was a dormant period when there wasn't much being produced, and then stuff started sparking with a whole graphic novel thing. But you know, Art Spiegelman had already done that Prisoner of the Hell Planet, which is the core of Mouse. That was back in the underground comics days that he was working on that. So that was something he worked on his whole life. You know, something I've become aware of, I feel like bringing up, just during the long shutdown, I've had lots of time to think. And I think that sexism was incorporated in my career more than I realized at the time. That I just, you know, I was happy to do work that I could get, but I didn't have the courage of my convictions enough to just forge ahead and think I deserved to do whatever I wanted to do and get it published. And also, to be perfectly honest, the men of that school that did that, you know, they were mostly living off their wives, working as well as doing all the housework. I never really felt it was my responsibility to exploit other people so I could create my art. But now I'm getting Social Security, so finally I might have a few good years. I can just do whatever I want to do. So that's the situation. But I do think there was a certain amount of sexism involved in just how low I kept my head, and even the two men have to have their names almost as big as my name for that book to be published.
And just
Oh, you found a lot of strange and wonderful things, didn't you?
yeah,
See, that has a chess knight tattoo on my cheek because I had just taken up playing tournament chess at that time after playing on my high school chess team. And I'm married to a professional chess player, and that's another facet of mine. Like there are a few short stories that have chess in them that probably aren't published anywhere you could find them ever.
Well, that's quite an honor. This was from 1975, a series of 52, 53, 54 cartoonists that were honored this way.
Well, that's all the Stanisky was a big supporter of us. We all have things we can be grateful to him for having made possible.
And then just rounding things out, this is a free-for-all mural about a party in women's comics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully we'll all, or at least a good portion of us will be able to get together again.
Well, that was wonderful how Fantagraphics brought out that deluxe edition, that two-book edition of women's comics collected.
Yes, makes a lot of work accessible that otherwise would have disappeared. Definitely. I was amazed at how much stuff was in there that I didn't even remember.
Now this is going as far back as we can go, right? This was your entry into comics, Sharon?
Women's comics, the first one. When was the first women's comic? I guess was it 71? I guess it was 71. Yeah. I had been working on several underground newspapers, and the last one was in San Francisco. It was called The Good Times. And I think I did, a sort of 4-panel cartoon or two, and then 1 or 2 just like square panel cartoons at the for The Good Times, and for a newspaper I worked for in Madison, Wisconsin called Takeover, that were political cartoons. But as far as something actually in comic book form, 1971 was the first one. Yeah, but Trina actually came by The Good Times. We were folding our tents. There was no longer a market for anti-war underground newspapers. People were moving on to getting business degrees and going to singles bars and such. And Trina came shortly before we disbanded the commune completely and said, I want to put out a comic book by women. Are there any women here who want to draw comics? And I want to draw comics. And, that's the beginning of the whole thing. So I have that to thank her for, among many other things.
That's perfect. That gives me the whole picture right there. And of course, we're back to Paul Robeson. What a beautiful book. Everyone should get it. Of course, it's relevant for today's times. And if you've never heard of Paul Robeson, a lot of young people, this will be something new for them to discover.
The Fatal Moon's case is signaling that this is the beginning of his final descent into his brain damage, that he'll no longer be able to be. He'll always be the Paul Robeson we know and love, but he'll never be able to function again anywhere nearly the way he was able to. He's sort of propped up and able to appear in a few things and for a page or two, and then that's the end of it. Well, what was going through my mind is that he's feverish and that he's hallucinating, and that boy and the horses are actually a hallucination. And I was thinking of the old Twilight Zone, Room for One More. Are you familiar with Twilight Zone? And that one of those horses is for Paul in his hallucination, that he's going to get out of that in his hallucination, he's going to get out of the train. And the boy's holding the horse, one for himself and one for Paul. And they're going to ride off into the unknown mountains, and that will be Paul's disappearance. But it doesn't happen. But that was sort of the feeling I had when I was drawing it. But that's how it was. His breakdown was presenting itself to him.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I
have.
I wanted to allow you to add one last bit of insight, if you like. Any parting comments?
Buy my book. Buy many copies of my book and give it to people. No, I don't know. I don't buy people's books, so it's really unfair for me to say that. But in any way you can, support work and support groups that you feel are advancing, your core beliefs. Don't be dissuaded from your core beliefs, by all the noise that we're even in isolation that we're all subject to now. It's a time to really think through it, what's important and what to cleave to and what to fight for. I don't think anybody knows the end of this story, and you know, we're all a part of it. And I just urge you to, you know, don't give up hope, but don't give up fighting either. I guess, yeah, here's one last thing I haven't had a chance to say. There's a lot of talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and that, you know, if you've been in some horrible situation and something similar happens, it's a sound or a flash of light or something, you can never entirely walk away from it. If you've been through something in your youth, like being part of the beginning of the civil rights movement, being part of the beginning of the anti-war movement, seeing the numbers in the streets grow and grow and grow, and then seeing the power, the powers that be actually bend to the will of the people. However it turned out that we didn't get everything we hoped for, however it turned out that we might have been cheated and tricked, you know, to have that feeling at a young informative age, I think it changes you for life. I don't think you can ever become as cynical or as hopeless as you might have been able to be turned otherwise. You know, that's always within me, just like a fearful thing like being someone else. That, you know, if I drag myself out for one last protest, maybe this will be the one that'll swell and that'll get people to join and that'll really do the things that need to be done. I won't give up hope.
Okay, well, that's a perfect place to put a cap to it. Thank you so very much, Sharon, for doing this interview.
Thank you for listening to me.